Share the very latest out of Ukraine with you as you're taking a look at some video right there. Millions of households were left without power after Russia conducted a massive attack against Ukraine's energy infrastructure, firing nearly 200 missiles and drones. Ukrainian officials said that attack happened on Thursday. Now, this was Russia's second major aerial attack on Ukraine's power grid in less than 2 weeks. Ukraine's energy minister wrote in a post on Facebook, quote, "Attacks on energy facilities are happening all over Ukraine," adding that emergency power outages were implemented nationwide. Around half of Ukraine's energy infrastructure has been destroyed during the almost 3 years of war with Russia. Meanwhile, Russia's defense minister arrived in North Korea on Friday for talks with North Korean military and political leaders as the countries deepen their cooperation over Russia's war in Ukraine. In announcing the visit, Russia's defense ministry did not say who specifically would be taking part in the talks or what the purpose of those talks were. North Korean state media did not immediately confirm that visit. However, the visit comes days after South Korean president met with a Ukrainian delegation led by Ukraine's defense minister and called for the two countries to formulate countermeasures in response to North Korea's dispatch of thousands of troops to Russia to help its fight against Ukraine. To speak more on this, I do want to bring in Mark Temnycky, who is a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council Eurasia Center. Mark, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us.
Thank you again for having me.
So I did want to start off with Russia's attack on Ukraine's electrical and energy infrastructure. What can you share about that strategy?
It's a way of Russia getting desperate because it understands that it has sustained numerous casualties throughout the 3-year invasion. Russia has lost tens of billions of dollars in equipment and military capabilities to attack the Ukrainians, and they've lost over 100 billion rubles as a result of international sanctions. It's a way to try to invoke fear on the Ukrainian population. Russia first started targeting the Ukrainian energy sector in 2015 when it conducted cyber attacks in the winter, which were successful. Having learned from that, they also conducted cyber attacks in 2016 and 2021. And they are trying to shut down the energy throughout Ukraine in the winter months because they understand it's a cold area during this time of year, and Eastern Europe is known to be very chill and with the snow and difficult capabilities, and it's a way to try to further invoke fear on the Ukrainian population to try to push for some sort of negotiation with the Russians, as the Russians realize if they can't defeat the Ukrainians militarily, they will go after the civilian population.
And you were mentioning that, from your perspective, this strategy shows desperation on the part of Russia. Russia, they sent a delegation, or the defense minister, arrived in North Korea for some talks with military and political leaders. No word yet on, exactly what they were talking about. But we do know that North Korean troops have really partnered with the Russian military to fight in this war. What can you share with us about the visit? We don't know the specifics, but the fact that they are continuing to meet.
Russia is trying to see how it can obtain additional strategies and resources for the war that it's launching, because it understands the amount of billions of dollars it's lost as a result of its war. There were accounts today from the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, which was confirmed also by the United Kingdom's Ministry of Defense, that there are roughly 700,000 casualties on the Russian side to date. And the Russians need more soldiers, they need more manpower, and that's why they're cooperating with the North Koreans, and the North Koreans send soldiers. The Russians are also hiring mercenaries from Yemen and Syria and parts of Africa, as well as they hired some individuals from Asia, specifically India, to fight in its war. And this is important because while the Russians are meeting with the North Koreans now, several members of the European Union are in Ukraine this weekend, meeting with Ukrainian authorities. And on December 3rd and 4th, this upcoming week, Ukraine will be meeting with various defense ministers during the defense ministry summit that NATO has this week to discuss more of how NATO and the Western world and the international community continue providing assistance to Ukraine during this difficult period.
And you bring up NATO. Ukraine wants to become a NATO member, and Ukrainian President Zelenskyy has suggested that he might temporarily cede some of the Ukrainian territory to Russia in exchange for joining NATO. What can you share with us about that strategy and the significance if Ukraine were to actually become a NATO member?
It is not the first time that a country would be divided in being part of NATO. For example, NATO was founded in 1949, and at the time, West Germany was a democratic independent country, whereas East Germany was controlled by the Soviets. And from 1949 to the 1980s, West Germany was part of NATO. The Soviet Union did not launch attacks or invade West Germany while it controlled East Germany. Similarly, NATO had a relationship with various countries around Europe, but Sweden and Finland were not part of NATO for several decades until Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022. Sweden and Finland eventually became part of NATO, and as a retaliation, Russia did nothing. Similarly, the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, as well as Poland, after the Soviet Union and communism collapsed in Eastern Europe, these countries joined NATO and the European Union in the early 2000s, and there was no invasion or attack by the Russians on these countries. Ukraine should be no different, and the Ukrainians should be allowed to pursue NATO membership because NATO is an invitation to join a military alliance, and countries are required to fulfill a certain amount of reforms, both militarily as well as in the government, to try to eliminate and weed out corruption, to strengthen institutions in these countries, and it would become a more democratic state in Ukraine's case.
So how likely is it that Ukraine becomes a NATO member?
NATO has repeated several times that Ukraine is on the path toward NATO membership. However, there is a division within NATO. Countries that are in Central or Eastern Europe, such as Poland and the three Baltic states I mentioned earlier, are all in favor of Ukrainian membership to NATO because they understand the threat that Russia poses, and it's a democratic and military alliance. However, countries such as Germany and the United States are more reserved to allow Ukraine to join NATO, and there is really a divide, although Western countries like France, for instance, are also supportive of Ukraine joining NATO, so that there is an internal debate on, while it is the forthcoming deal that Ukraine will become part of NATO at some time, that is the nuance, and then it is not specified how and when this would occur.
I also want to go back because we know that, Russia's defense minister was in North Korea. Meanwhile, South Korean leaders met with Ukrainian leaders as well. What can you share with us about that?
The South Koreans are now beginning to allow defense capabilities to be sent from South Korea to Ukraine, which will be used specifically against North Korean troops. And the South Koreans are examining with Ukraine how to send additional forms of assistance in terms of humanitarian and medical and financial aid, in addition to the defense assistance that they are sending to the Ukrainians to fight off the invading North Korean forces.
Mark, before we let you go, is there any other development that you're keeping a very close eye on, or an issue that we didn't get to that you would like to share with our viewers?
It's important that the international community continue providing defense assistance to Ukraine, which is allowing the Ukrainians to fight off the invading Russian force. And it works both ways in that countries such as the United States are sending old military equipment to Ukraine to use for its fight, while the United States is building and creating new defense capabilities at home. And a lot of the figures that are thrown out, such as $50 billion that the United States is sending to Ukraine, is actually broken out in numerous components, where a lot of that money is used to help factories in states such as Ohio or Pennsylvania, where Americans are working and building this infrastructure and the weapons that Ukrainians need. It's employing Americans in the United States. It's helping the economies, not only in the United States, but in these states specifically that have these factories. And it is allowing the United States to strengthen national security while also helping one of its allies overseas.
All right, Mark, we do appreciate you taking the time to join us here on Live Now from Fox.
Thank you again for having me.